If the God of the Old Testament is cruel, then you are a monster. Now, why do I say that? I was having a discussion with my brother and sister-in-law the other day about the God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New Testament, and this is a critique that Christian skeptics, critics bring up all the time. They talk about how cruel the God of the Old Testament is, and they often go out and pick a few verses from the Old Testament, which, by the way, is a huge section of text, and they say, oh, look, here's one. God's judging these people. That's so cruel. He's so mean. There's no grace in the Old Testament. But this is what I would encourage you to do. And that is to actually read the whole thing and to try to comprehend what you're reading and the context in which these passages exist. Read the whole story of the Old Testament and actually take the time to do the timeline of just how much time is passing between the judgments that God brings on these particular people. I think what you're going to find is that you're actually quite enlightened by the realization that God is not cruel. He's actually extraordinarily patient. Because in many cases, it takes him centuries to bring judgment on people who deserve it. There are people who are betraying him, who are sinning against him, who are doing all kinds of really heinous, old, ancient evils. And yet, he gives them decades and centuries to repent. He often sends them people, prophets, priests, calling them to repent and saying, straighten up or I'm going to have to punish you. And often there's huge swathes of time between God's judgments on these people, even though the wickedness just abounds and abounds. And I want you to think about that. God takes so long to judge. What is that? Is that cruelty? No, that's mercy and patience and love and grace. Now, I want to ask you a question about how long you would tolerate somebody betraying you, committing crimes against you, doing all kinds of heinous evils against you and your loved ones and the people in your community. How long would you tolerate that before you spoke up about it, before you called people to justice, before you went to the courts or to the police and got them involved and tried to get these people thrown in jail or, some kind of judicial judgment against them? The reality is most of us, if someone was committing a crime against us, most of us would be in the court system within a matter of weeks. God takes centuries, and he is the judge with all of the power, and yet sometimes centuries of patience and waiting for his people to come around and to fix their lives and to stop doing their evils. So what does that say about us? Our patience is so incredibly limited. Our mercy, our grace that we're willing to extend to other people who do us wrong is so limited, and yet God's is so great. So if God is cruel, what does that make us? If centuries of grace and mercy make you cruel, then what can we say about ourselves who can barely wait a few days if somebody is doing us wrong to call down justice on their heads? I think that would make us a monster. And that's why I started this video out the way that I did. We sometimes look at God and we want to apply one standard of judgment to him when we would never tolerate the things that he tolerates for the length of time that he tolerates them for. So before you go accusing the God of the Old Testament of cruelty and being quick to wrath and things like that, go read the Old Testament, please, and actually do the work to understand what you're reading and the amount of time that's being covered. And I think what you find in the Old Testament is actually an extraordinarily patient and gracious God, rather than this caricature of him that's being put out by a lot of critics, Christian critics, biblical critics, deconstructionists, and things like that. It really doesn't line up with the facts, the details. So if God is cruel, then what does that make us? That's a good question to ask.